The banishment of the great chamber of the Galactic Council stretched before Admiral Elena Vasquez like a cathedral of judgment. Thousands of alien representatives filled the curved tiers that spiraled upward into darkness, their varied forms creating a tapestry of the galaxy's diversity. Crystalline beings that sang their thoughts in harmonic frequencies sat beside gaseous entities contained within environmental suits, reptilian delegates with scales that shifted color based on emotion shared space with insectoid creatures, whose compound eyes reflected the chamber's dim lighting like 1,000 tiny stars. Alina stood alone in the center of the vast floor, her human form seeming impossibly small beneath the weight of so many alien gazes. She wore her dress uniform, the blue fabric pressed sharp, her medals catching what little light filtered down from above. At 52, her dark hair was streaked with silver, and her brown eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had commanded fleets across the void. Behind her, the holographic displays showed the evidence that had brought humanity to this moment. The council speaker, Ambassador Zixtran of the Saurian hegemony, rose from his elevated position. His reptilian features were ancient even by his species standards, with scales that had deepened to an almost black-green over his centuries of life. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of ages, translated into perfect human English by the Chamber's neural network. Admiral Elena Vasquez of the Terran Federation, Zixtran began, his voice echoing through the vast space. You stand accused of the most serious crime possible under galactic law. Your species has committed acts of genetic contamination that threaten the very fabric of our cosmic order. Alina remained standing straight, her hands clasped behind her back. She had known this day would come ever since the first reports reached Earth about what humans were becoming on the frontier worlds. The evidence was undeniable, but she refused to show fear before these beings who had decided her species' fate without truly understanding what they were judging. Dr. James Chen stepped forward from the small group of human representatives allowed in the chamber. He was a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, his lab coat looking out of place among the formal attire of diplomats and military officers. As Earth's leading evolutionary biologist, he had been studying the changes in human colonists. For the past 20 years, Honorable Council, Dr. Chen said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. What you call contamination, we call adaptation. Humanity has always evolved to meet the challenges of new environments. This is not genetic warfare, but natural selection at work. A series of angry, chittering sounds erupted from the insectoid section of the chamber. The translation system rendered their agitation into words. Natural selection does not work at such speeds. No species evolves in mere decades. The evidence displays shifted, showing colonists from the methane world of Titan 7. These humans had developed secondary respiratory systems and skin that could process atmospheric chemicals directly. On the high-gravity world of Kepler Prime, children were being born with enhanced bone density and cardiovascular systems that would have been impossible for baseline humans. Most shocking of all were the colonists from the radiation-bathed moons of Proxima Centauri, whose DNA had reorganized itself to not just resist lethal radiation, but to use it as an energy source. This is what we fear, announced a crystalline being whose thoughts rang like bells. Humanity spreads across worlds and changes to fit them. But in changing, they change the worlds themselves. Their children are no longer human, yet they are. More than human, they are becoming something we cannot predict or control. Captain Rosa Martinez stood with the other human observers, her heart heavy as she watched the proceedings. She had personally overseen the evacuation of 17 colonies over the past year, pulling families from worlds they had called home for generations. The tears in children's eyes as they were forced to leave behind everything they knew haunted her dreams. These were not monsters or genetic weapons. They were families who had simply learned to thrive in places that would kill unmodified humans. Zixthron gestured to another set of displays. On Vega 4, human colonists have developed symbiotic relationships with the native crystal formations, their nervous systems interfacing directly with the planet's mineral network. On the water world of Aquarius Station, humans have grown gills and developed echolocation. On the desert planet of Aradase, they no longer need water in quantities that would sustain baseline humans. Alina finally spoke, her voice carrying across the chamber with the authority of someone who had seen humanity at its best and worst. We adapt because we must. We change because that is what life does when faced with new challenges. You fear us because we represent something you cannot understand. We are not trying to conquer the galaxy through genetics. We are trying to survive and thrive in it. But where does it end? Demanded a floating jellyfish-like creature, its bioluminescent patches pulsing with agitation. Your species shows no limits to its adaptations. In another 1,000 years, what will humanity become? What will you be capable of? You could eventually adapt to survive in the vacuum of space itself, to live on the surface of stars, to exist in dimensions we cannot even perceive. The truth of those words hung in the air like a sword. Even Alina could not deny the implications. Humanity's adaptability was accelerating, not slowing down. Each new generation of colonists showed changes that previous generations would have considered impossible. The galaxy's older races had reached evolutionary stability billions of years ago. They had found their perfect forms and stopped changing. But humanity was still growing, still becoming. Dr. Chen tried once more to explain, this ability is not a weapon we created. It is not something we can turn on or off. It is simply who we are as a species. We have always been explorers, always been survivors. Give us a frozen wasteland, and we will learn to thrive in the cold. Give us a world of acid rain, and we will develop skin that turns poison into nutrition. This is not aggression, this is adaptation. But the Council had already made its decision. The vote had been taken before the trial began. This was merely ceremony, a final chance for humanity to explain itself before the sentence was carried out. The Council has reached a unanimous verdict, Zixthron announced, his ancient voice carrying a note of what might have been regret. Humanity poses an existential threat to the stability of galactic civilization. Your species' unlimited potential for change threatens the natural order that has maintained peace for 10 million years. Therefore, by the authority granted to this Council by the Galactic Compact, humanity is hereby banished from all inhabited star systems. Alina felt the words like physical blows, but she kept her expression neutral. She had expected this, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that cut deep into her soul. All human colonies will be evacuated within one standard galactic year, the sentence continued. Humanity will return to your system of origin, Sol, and remain there under quarantine. Any attempt to leave your home system will be met with immediate military action. This sentence is final and without appeal. The evacuation that followed was the largest migration in galactic history. 200 human colonies across 80 star systems had to be abandoned. Admiral Elena Vasquez commanded the massive fleet of transport ships that carried humanity's dreams back to Earth. Captain Rosa Martinez led the efforts on the frontier worlds, organizing the heart-wrenching departures of families from homes they had built with their own hands. Dr. Chen worked with colonial administrators to preserve as much scientific data as possible. The evolutionary changes observed in human colonists represented centuries of research that would be lost if they could not bring the information home. More importantly, the colonists themselves represented living proof of humanity's potential. These adapted humans would be the foundation for whatever came next. The journey home took 8 months. Ships designed for cargo hauling were converted into passenger vessels. Families crowded into spaces meant for machinery and supplies. Children who had never seen Earth except in history books stared out viewports at the empty void, knowing they were leaving behind the only homes they had ever known. As the last transport ship crossed into Sol System, Alina stood on the bridge watching Earth grow larger in the view screen. Behind them, the Galactic Council was installing a quantum isolation barrier that would prevent any human ship from leaving the system. The technology was beyond human understanding, creating a fold in space-time that would simply redirect the vessel that tried to cross it back to where it came from. But as Alina watched Earth's blue marble grow larger, she was not thinking about barriers or quarantine. She was thinking about the adapted humans now crowding Earth's cities and stations. The gill-breathing colonists from Aquarius, the radiation-immune settlers from Proxima, the crystal-integrated families from Vega-4, all of these people, with their impossible adaptations, were now confined to one system. Asterisk. General Marcus Thompson met the fleet at Lunar Station, his weathered face grim as he received the reports. Earth's military commander was a practical man who understood that this exile was not an ending, but a beginning. "How many did we get out?" he asked Alina as they reviewed the evacuation statistics. "Almost everyone," Alina replied, studying the data streaming across her tablet. 97% of colonial populations made it to the transports. We lost some settlements that were too remote or too hostile for evacuation, but most of our people are safe, and the genetic data, the research." Dr. Chen stepped forward, his tired eyes showing the strain of the past months. "We preserved everything. More than that, we have living examples of every major adaptation humanity has achieved. The Council thinks they have caged us, but they have actually given us the greatest laboratory in human history." Alina nodded, understanding what Chen meant. Earth's system contained hundreds of different environments. The asteroid belt, the gas giant atmospheres, the ice moons of the outer planets, the solar radiation near Mercury. If human adaptability was truly unlimited, then this system could become the testing ground for adaptations the galaxy had never imagined. "They fear what we might become," Alina said, looking out at the stars that were now forbidden to her people. "But they have given us time and space to become exactly that. When we return to the galaxy, we will not be the same species." They banished. The quantum barrier hummed with alien energy, sealing humanity into their home system like prisoners in their own cage. But barriers were meant to keep things in or out, and Alina was already wondering if the Council had considered what would happen when the cage became too small for what humanity was becoming. As Earth's fleet settled into their new reality, deep in the research stations and colonial habitats, human children continued to be born. And with each new generation, the adaptations continued. The exile had begun, but so had humanity's greatest evolutionary leap. Asterisk, the return 500 years had passed since the Great Banishment. though time itself had become a fluid concept for humanity. Captain Aria Vasquez Prime stood in the command center of the dimensional ship Evolution's Edge, her form barely recognizable as the baseline human her ancestor Alina had been. Her skin held a faint luminescent quality that could shift to match any spectrum of light, while her enhanced neural networks allowed her to process information at quantum speeds. The bridge around her was unlike anything the ancient Galactic Council could have imagined. Crystalline interfaces grown from adapted human neural tissue responded to thought as much as touch. The ship itself existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that had no names in any galactic language. Humanity had not just adapted to their prison, they had transcended it entirely. "Captain, we are approaching the threshold," announced Commander Kai Santos, his voice carrying harmonics that conveyed emotional and tactical data simultaneously. His eyes had evolved to see across 17 different spectrums, while his nervous system interfaced directly with the ship's dimensional navigation systems. "The quantum barrier is still in place around Sol System, but it no longer affects our vessels." Aria nodded, her consciousness expanding to touch the ship's sensory networks. Through them, she could perceive the barrier that had once contained humanity like a soap bubble around their home system. It was still there, still powered by Galactic Council technology, but it was designed to stop ships that moved through normal space. Humanity no longer traveled that way. "Begin phase transition," Aria commanded, her words rippling through dimensions that bent around the ship. "Take us into Council space." It is time they learned what they created. The Evolution's Edge slipped between layers of reality like a knife cutting through paper. Around them, dozens of other human vessels followed, each one a masterwork of adapted biotechnology and evolved engineering. These ships were grown rather than built, their hulls incorporating genetic material from the crystal beings of Vega 4. Their navigation systems derived from the quantum-sensitive humans, who had learned to see through time itself. Dr. James Chen no longer existed in any single physical form. His consciousness had been preserved and expanded into a collective intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions. When he spoke, his voice came from the ship's communication arrays, carrying the wisdom of 5 centuries of evolution. "Aria, the long-range sensors are detecting massive changes in Council space. It appears our absence has not led to the peace they expected." The data streams flowing into Aria's consciousness painted a grim picture. The Galactic Council, having removed humanity's destabilizing influence, had turned inward. Without a common focus for their fears, the ancient alliance had fractured into competing factions. Several species had been enslaved by their more powerful neighbors. Others had been driven to extinction for genetic impurity or evolutionary regression. "They feared our potential for change," Aria mused, her enhanced empathy allowing her to feel the suffering of billions across the galaxy. "But in removing us, they eliminated the only species that actively sought to understand and cooperate with others instead of dominating them." The human fleet moved through space like schools of living light, their dimensional drives allowing them to appear anywhere in the galaxy instantaneously. Their first stop was the Kepler cluster, where the gentle methane weavers had once created beautiful art from atmospheric gases. Intelligence reports suggested the entire species had been enslaved by the Saurian hegemony and forced to work in toxic processing plants. As the human ships materialized above Kepler Prime, Aria felt her heart break for what the galaxy had become. The planet's atmosphere, once a canvas for the methane weaver's art, was now polluted with industrial waste. The graceful creatures that had once danced through their aerial cities were confined to underground factories, their gossamer wings clipped to prevent escape. "This ends now," Arya declared, her voice carrying through dimensional channels to every human ship in the fleet. "We return not as conquerors, but as liberators. We have learned to become whatever the situation requires. Today, we become hope." The liberation of Kepler Prime took less than an hour. Human soldiers, their bodies adapted to exist in any environment, simply walked through the planet's toxic atmosphere without protection. Their presence alone began changing the atmospheric composition, their evolved biology processing the pollutants and converting them back into the gases the methane weavers needed to survive. Commander Kai Santos led the ground forces, his enhanced communication abilities allowing him to speak directly to the methane weavers in their own chemical language. "We are humans," he told them as they stared in wonder at beings who could survive in what had become a death trap. "We were exiled from the galaxy 500 years ago. We have returned to set things right." The rescue operation was broadcast across galactic communication networks, and the message was clear. Humanity had returned, but they were no longer the species that had been banished. They were something new, something powerful, and something that cared about the suffering of others. News of humanity's return reached the Galactic Council within hours. In the same chamber where Alina Vasquez had stood trial centuries before, emergency sessions were called. Elder Zixtran, now ancient beyond measure and kept alive only by cybernetic implants, struggled to comprehend the reports flooding in. "Impossible." He wheezed through his artificial voice box. "The barrier is still in place. Our sensors show no breaches. How are they here?" The answer came in the form of dimensional distortions throughout Council space. Human ships began appearing at enslaved worlds across the galaxy, but they were not the crude metal vessels that had been banished. These ships were alive, grown from genetic templates that incorporated beneficial traits from dozens of species. They moved through space like living creatures, their hulls adapting to environmental conditions in real time. Each liberation followed the same pattern. Human forces would arrive, immediately begin adapting to local conditions, and free whatever species had been oppressed. But instead of claiming the worlds for themselves, they would restore the environment and return control to the original inhabitants. They asked for nothing in return except the promise that the freed species would help others in need. The pattern was so consistent that even the Council's most paranoid members began to realize something profound had changed about humanity. These were not the aggressive, expansion-minded colonists they remembered. These beings seemed genuinely motivated by compassion and cooperation. The confrontation came when the human fleet materialized directly outside the Council's home system. Unlike 5 centuries ago, humanity had not requested permission or sent diplomatic messages. They simply appeared, their dimensional ships filling the void around the political heart of galactic civilization. Arya Vasquez Prime stood once again in the great chamber of the Galactic Council, but this time she was not alone. With her stood representatives of every species humanity had liberated, as well as new forms of life that had never existed before. These were the hybrid colonies, communities where humans had not just adapted to alien environments, but had actually merged genetically with other species to create entirely new forms of consciousness. Elder Zixtran, propped up by his mechanical supports, stared at Arya with eyes that held 5 centuries of fear. "You have returned," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We knew this day would come. Are you here for revenge?" Arya's response carried the wisdom of her entire species' evolutionary journey. We are here because the galaxy is dying without diversity. You feared our ability to change, so you removed us. But in doing so, you eliminated the one force that was actively working to preserve and protect the uniqueness of every species. She gestured to the liberated beings standing with her. Look around you. Half the species in this chamber are extinct or enslaved. The other half live in fear of joining them. You created stability by eliminating change, but stability without growth is death. Dr. Chen's collective consciousness manifested in the chamber as a shimmering field of energy that spoke, with voices from across the dimensions. We have learned something in our exile that we wish to share. Evolution is not about becoming superior to others. It is about becoming whatever is needed to help life flourish. We can become crystal to communicate with silicon-based life. We can become gas to understand the cloud dancers. We can become energy to preserve consciousness beyond physical death. The demonstration that followed left the entire council in stunned silence. Before their eyes, human representatives began changing. Not just adapting, but consciously evolving in real time to match the biological patterns of every species present. A human became crystalline to communicate with the mineral beings, grew feathers to speak with the avian delegates, developed bioluminescence to interface with the deep space entities. This is what we offer, Arya continued, her form now shifting between states as her words addressed each species in their optimal communication format. Not conquest, not replacement, but cooperation. We have learned to become bridges between forms of life that could never communicate before. We can be translators, mediators, and partners in a way no single species ever could. Elder Zixthron felt tears forming in his ancient eyes as he finally understood what the council had lost. We banished you because we feared you would make us obsolete, he admitted. But instead, you became the solution to problems we did not even know we had. The new Galactic Compact that emerged from those negotiations was unlike anything in cosmic history. Instead of a council that ruled through fear and stability, the galaxy gained a commonwealth where diversity was not just tolerated but actively cultivated. Humanity took their place not as rulers but as facilitators, using their unlimited adaptability to help other species achieve their own evolutionary potential. The quantum barrier around Sol System was dismantled, but not because humanity needed to leave. Instead, the Sol System became the galaxy's greatest laboratory and university, where species from across the cosmos could come to study adaptation, evolution, and cooperation. Earth itself became a living museum of possibility, where beings could see what life looked like when it was free to become whatever it needed to be. Captain Arya Vascasprim stood on the observation deck of a station orbiting Earth, watching. Ships from hundreds of species arrived to study and learn. Her ancestor Alina had been right about one thing. When humanity returned to the galaxy, they were no longer the same species that had been banished. They had become something the galaxy desperately needed but had never dared to hope for. They had become the living proof that evolution and cooperation could create possibilities beyond anyone's imagination. The exile had ended, but the real journey was just beginning. Asterisk.